Hello. In episode 35, season 2 of AS for Architecture, I spoke with Charles Holland, once of FAT, and now principal of Charles Holland Architects, and freshly minted professor at the University of the Creative Arts, Canterbury, about his design, research and writing, including his 2022 Davidson Prize-winning proposal, Co-Living in the Countryside, developed in collaboration with the artist verity Jane Keefe and designer and urbanist Joseph Zeal Henry.
What we developed was an idea of a sort of rental self-build or rental community build model, and that therefore you'd have sort of long-term investment and long-term security in your rental model. You could adapt and change your house. It was run by, a trust that's part of a housing association that works with the local authority that initially owns the land. And so that's sort of the two things really, the idea of how the housing could be quite simple but allow huge diversity of expression, and then how that might actually enable people to live in it over time, sort of work together. So in that sense, a stylistic eclecticism and an idea of a relationship between the sort of collective and the individual were the two really important kind of parts of that scheme.
AS for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of AS for Architecture. I'm talking today to Charles Holland, Professor Charles Holland, architect and Professor of Architecture at University of the Creative Arts in Canterbury. Charles, that's a short intro. Would you like to embellish that?
Yes, hi everybody. Yes, I can a little bit. I'm an architect, a teacher and a writer. I run a practice called Charles Holland Architects, which I've been running since 2016. And before that, I was a director of FAT architecture for some 20 years. Alongside that, I've always taught. I was a professor of architecture at the University of Brighton prior to my current appointment at UCA Canterbury. And I've taught at lots of other places. I've taught at the Royal College of Art, University of Greenwich. I've taught at the ABK in Stuttgart, and also FAT ran a studio for a number of semesters at Yale School of Architecture in the US. And I write a bit too about buildings and about design and architecture reviews. And I used to run, back in the days when people did such things, I wrote a blog called Fantastic Journal.
That's a pretty good introduction, and a busy man. But you're based down in Dover now, which I think is kind of, it's sort of surprising, I suppose, because when one encounters critically acclaimed and movers and shakers in the world of architecture, you expect them to be in big, massive cities, by and large, but you're not. How do you find yourself in Dover?
Well, I moved out of London in 2015-16 when I started my new practice. And I had been living in London basically since I left home and studied architecture, and then formed or became one of the directors of FAT. So I've been based out all that time. And when FAT came to an end, and the last project that I worked on as part of FAT, which is a House for Essex, finished, which was a sort of year and a half or 2 years after FAT kind of ceased working together formally. I guess I was faced with a bit of a dilemma as to what to do next. Quite a happy dilemma in a way, like I was interested and excited about what to do next. I was pretty sure I wanted to start some kind of new practice, but what I didn't want to do is start a new practice in the same way and in the same place. I was given an opportunity, I suppose, to sort of rethink where I'd be, so I moved. Well, my family and I moved. We moved to Deal on the Kent coast, and that felt like a bit of a sort of new adventure, new start. And slowly sort of formed a new practice. I chose Dover because Dover's a very interesting place, and Deal's very pleasant. And got a very interesting and rich history too. But Dover's a place that are kind of perhaps architecturally at a more interesting place right now. It's a kind of industrial port town. It suffers from quite a lot of social deprivation. It's got this incredible kind of architectural history and topography. There are things afoot in Dover and a chance to maybe do work in this area that seems quite interesting and important. I think some of my interests had slightly shifted from the kind of urban and the city, and I've become very interested in kind of non-urban situations for architecture, which I think partly stems from a sense that not that many people are looking at that, and that consequently, certainly in the field of housing, and we'll probably come back to that, all of the kind of quality and the thinking and the sort of effort has been on sort of cities and big cities. And so I was interested, or had a growing interest in looking at places that were outside of that, and Dover having specific kind of challenges and interests. And so I live in Deal, but I based my office in Dover, and we're in Castle Street, which is a sort of fairly well preserved Georgian street in an otherwise not particularly well preserved town. And so we've got a view of the castle at one end and Market Square in the centre of Dover at the other.
Yeah, it's an amazing town. It's an amazing topography. Kent is, I mean, I live just north of you most of the time, and yeah, it's an extraordinary place. But I really like this idea of kind of shifting, and I think this is when I contacted you, I suggested some themes which were just sort of shots in the dark, really, and you came back and you asked, and you suggested that you wanted to speak about these ideas of the rural as a kind of counterpoint for architecture to the city. And I was wondering if perhaps there was, like, what I suppose in a kind of simple way, what have you found about this? So the post-industrial condition, and obviously Dover is partly that, but there's a lot of Kent coastline that is that. What have you found specific about the context of Dover that is and the rural kind of spaces around it that requires a new architecture, I suppose, or a different form of architecture, or a different approach to architecture?
Well, I think there's probably two different things there. One is the rural, and one is perhaps Dover. They're not as important, probably, to state that they're not the same. In terms of the rural, that's a kind of a sort of emerging interest, I guess, for me over a number of years. Where in studios I've been teaching previously at Brighton and now UCA, where we've looked at quite sensitive rural locations, particularly in relation to new housing. And I'm very interested in the fact that, essentially new housing in non-metropolitan centres is delivered more or less the same way everywhere. That is to say, it's done by developers, usually the big PLCs, but sometimes slightly smaller local ones who sort of follow the same pattern. We're normally talking about one or two sort of fields on the edge of a settlement, town, village, a spine road that goes through the middle of it, and then a series of kind of mostly detached houses that dot around that. And, there might be some vague genuflection towards the idea of the sort of local vernacular, more or less, might be slightly more or less expensive materials, but essentially the model's the same. And it seems that we've really, I guess as a society, sort of just abandoned the idea of architecture having anything to say about those places and any influence over them. Those developers generally might use an architect, usually to unlock, planning value, but that architect will be incredibly limited in the scope of what they can suggest or do. It's entirely run by sort of market economics and by marketing, essentially, what's deemed sellable. Planning will sort of tweak around the edges, trying to say maybe you should do a little bit here or a little bit there to kind of change the formula. But essentially, we've just sort of abandoned the idea that we're making anything at all deliberately. It's kind of what comes out if you feed all these things in one end, out the end you get these. And I'm not necessarily saying they're terrible, I guess, so much as it seems important that we might at least have a discussion about whether this is how we want to live and how we want to make places. And at the moment, no one is designing them really in any kind of sense that we might understand design, i.e. having some sort of overall sense of what those houses are about, how people live together, what kind of density we want to live in, what kind of accommodation we want to live in, how we might want to pay for that. None of those things are kind of happening. They've been left essentially to a kind of really denuded sense of the market. So I've become very kind of excited about that and looking at alternative ways that can be done, and what how we might make new bits of new villages essentially. And I think changes in technology and changes in lifestyle have made those things more relevant rather than less. Maybe like half a century ago, you'd say that's probably not where we should be looking. But now I actually think it is, at least partly, and very few people seem to be looking at it. So that's one thing.
So in a way, the architect has to become involved, unlike the urban architect. The regional or rural architect has to become involved at a much earlier stage in kind of starting to leverage their knowledge and their capacity to present totally different visions of what it is. I mean, because I suppose in the city, you get these tight little spaces and the architect is given a site and they're told they need to cram as much on as possible. Whereas in the countryside, it's like, we've got lots of space, so let's just... So like how do you operate as an architect in that space? I mean...
Well, yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think other things are happening in the city too. I mean, partly just the amount of interest, partly the way that, local government works in cities, the kind of attention paid to, things like, if one looks at London, one would look at kind of like London Housing Guide, one would look at the work of GLA, like a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of attention has gone into what is contemporary kind of housing in London. And of course, it's still very circumscribed by kind of commercial issues, land values principally, and therefore the density of housing. But, there's an awful lot of good housing produced out of those constraints. One might want it to be less dense, one might want the values to be vastly less inflated. But in terms of the quality of the architecture, there's a lot of good stuff coming out of that. And I think we all know what we mean by that. On the Sterling Prize each year, there'll be one or two, kind of high quality housing schemes that will pop up. You will not probably find very many rural housing schemes popping up. In a rural situation, it's different. And I think you're right. In some senses, I guess it's a question of the agency of the architect and what the architect is trying to do. I mean, I'm an old-fashioned democratic socialist, so I would like local authorities to be empowered and funded to build housing, and that to me would be the most profound way that one could tackle the kind of housing crisis in rural areas. But I'm also very interested in other ways it can happen. And as someone who's a fan of the writing of Colin Ward and other people, looking at a kind of history of experimental, communal, self-built, custom-built, other forms of interesting kind of housing delivery. I'm very, I think there's a lot of stuff in there that's interesting. And in that sense, architects do take on slightly different roles. They take on roles of enablers and, providing, I suppose, sorts of technical skills and knowledge to maybe enable communities to do new settlements and new housing. So there is scope, I think, for kind of expanded and different roles for the architect. But I don't think that's the only answer. And I think as much as I'm interested in, alternative delivery models of housing, I think in terms of how we envisage and form new settlements, I think that's a kind of collective endeavor.
A town like Dover really, to me, seems on a kind of very, I suppose, rather superficial level, seems to find its logic as a dependency or an extension of the urban. So Dover is the port through which the commerce of London is instrumentalized, delivered, whatever. And so it's architecture, the massive infrastructure that characterized a place like Dover, and also now more pertinently, perhaps equally pertinently, the migrant crisis that comes in through that, are really kind of logics of urban centers, or metropolitan logics. And I wonder whether there is a sense, and you see this all over the place. I had a student a year and a half ago called Mark Thompson, who wrote about this idea, having moved from London and from Edinburgh, moving down into rural Kent, and looking at the way that the logics of the urban permeate the rural, and to the extent that you rarely get something that is genuinely rural anymore. You get essentially a suburban pastiche, which does more or less an urban thing. I mean, do you find in a place like Dover a kind of a problem in that they're always, these peripheral or regional places are always essentially trying to replicate metropolitan languages, metropolitan aesthetics, metropolitan kind of economic logics as well?
Well, I think the important thing there is that they're part of those logics for sure. And so, the rural is interesting because it's presented or normally framed very obviously as the opposite of the urban, and implicit in that is an idea that's also the opposite of kind of contemporary or modern. Like modernism and urbanism are sort of bound up together. And the countryside or the rural, particularly in the UK, which has very complex and quite profoundly strange attitudes to the rural, very intensely sentimental. There's an idea that it's pitched as as the opposite of the urban, and therefore it doesn't have any of the problems of urbanization. It's a sort of sanctuary or a kind of bucolic escape. But of course that's nonsense. That modernism exists in rural places, and rural places are connected to all of the systems, the mechanisms of contemporary life: logistics, transportation, digital technology, communication. People in the countryside, weirdly, they work. There might be there are businesses, there are activities, there is kind of agriculture, which is kind of a vast business itself. There's no real sense that there's some kind of anti-urban really. So that interests me as well, a kind of idea that these things exist within the rural. It's a much more complex and kind of contradictory place than I guess popular mythology or popular culture says. So I think that's one thing. In terms of Dover, I think you're right. I mean, Dover historically is a place that's completely formed by its position internationally, and as a place that has always had an incredibly important mercantile and defensive kind of role, and it still is. So vast amounts of goods coming in and out of Dover. It's an incredibly successful commercially port, and it dominates the town in a lot of ways. But equally dominant in the town is a kind of overwhelming sort of nostalgia for a perceived more glorious past. It's really easy. I remember I will look on this Facebook page called Dover History Pages, which is run by this guy, and he unearths and posts about really incredible stuff. And there's a kind of really standard response, overwhelming standard response to any photo he posts, which is kind of over the age of 10 years, which will be, wasn't Dover good then? It doesn't matter what he put a picture of. It might be like, might be a sort of building of a dual carriageway in the 1960s, but there's a sort of sense that was a better dual carriageway than the one we have now. And he posted a sort of aerial photo of, sort of Victorian, I guess Edwardian or early 20th century Dover, and a map. And everyone said, oh, it's so much better around the port area in those days. And the thing is, it wasn't. And it really obviously wasn't. I mean, there were slums. It's always been quite a poor town, subject to a kind of constant influx of people that made it always quite an edgy place as well, and a very volatile sort of place. But there persists the kind of sense that there's some strange glorious moment in its past, or multiple glorious moments. So it's a place that embodies lots of, I guess, the sort of national psychosis in a way you could see that we're living through at the moment. It's a sort of Brexit front line. It embodies all of these weird contradictory impulses that exist in the UK now, which are deeply nostalgic, extremely troubled by a kind of contemporary position in the world, quite threatened by a lot of things, trading on past glories, with moments of extraordinary kind of history and sort of beauty occasionally. So it's really fascinating for that reason. And as you say, it's a place that's simultaneously hugely sentimental and completely unsentimental. So the unsentimental bit is the port, which just plows on, developing, growing, churning stuff through it with completely zero sentiment. I took part in a recent panel discussion about Dover, and I was chairing it, and I talked to a prominent member of the Port of Dover board, and I said, do you feel a kind of sense of responsibility? This amazing kind of topography and history, and there's the castle, and there's the Western Heights, and blah blah blah. And he said, well, did anyone ever, when they were developing Dover Harbour down the centuries, did they feel that sense of historical responsibility? No, they didn't. They just made what they had to make at the time. And he's right. When in the early 19th century, when they're digging enormous fortifications into the cliff face, they weren't thinking about Dover as a historical entity.
No.
They were making huge infrastructural interventions into the landscape. So I think that is super interesting about it. And then, of course, is its proximity to the countryside around it, which is quite extreme in the case of Dover, and it's surrounded largely, almost completely, by an area of outstanding natural beauty. So you get this very extreme disconnect between the two. So I think it's a super interesting place. And the third thing I'd say, I think that's quite compelling about it, is unlike a lot of seaside towns, where the model of regeneration is kind of arts led, and we're familiar with Turner Contemporary and Margate and the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne and Folkestone Triennale and stuff like that, just to choose ones on this particular stretch of coastline. Dover isn't like that. Dover is like a working place in that sense. It's dominant, it has one hugely successful industry. It might question how many people that employs, and it's lost industries too. But that makes it significantly different to a lot of places which historically traded on tourism and sort of seaside activities that weren't big commercial operations like this one. So I think it's kind of a super interesting place.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that word infrastructure is kind of key, isn't it? It's almost like a settlement of infrastructure that housing sort of adheres to, comes and goes from. And you see other cities like that. I mean, Birmingham has become a bit like that, but you see it certainly is very true of coastal places throughout the southeast of England, as I've encountered it so far. When we wrote, you raised this issue of style, and I was thinking, how do I move from talking about the rural to issues of style? And I called Alan Powers last night, and I asked him, because he thinks about style a lot, and you used to teach alongside him at Greenwich, and I asked him what is style, and he had lots of answers, and they were all very good. But I didn't have a pen and paper with me, and I got a memory like a sieve. So I'll go on a sense meaning rather than an absolute replication, but of what he said. But I was wondering whether you think that this kind of, so in places like Dover, where you have no overarching design language, it's really a design language of utility. but also in relation to this issue you mentioned earlier, which is that the unbelievable pouring out of suburbanization. And, it's perhaps a little bit checked by the area of outstanding natural beauty down around Dover and Deal and so on. But if you go up to North, Margate and westwards, they're just vomiting this stuff all the way through Faversham, whether it's the Prince/King or whether it's, I saw another site yesterday. I found another site yesterday. Redrow are going to go and throw down another load of housing. There's obviously this line between Margate and Canterbury, which is just filling up with pointless stuff. And it is kind of pointless. I've mentioned this before on the podcast when I spoke with Flora Samuel. She's encountered new build housing which has a lifespan of an intended lifespan of 7 years. 7 years. How can you get a mortgage on something with 7 years? I don't understand. Anyway, but I wonder whether that this problem, this anonymizing problem that we've got, particularly with the way that the rural is being consumed by volume house builders and by planning policies which preferences them, and a whole system of governance which preferences this very cheap building, aesthetic and anti everything really. Is the answer style, and I suppose this comes back to your work with FAT, is the answer starting to think about the language of architecture, the way that we style architecture? Is this a good enough answer? Is this going to resolve the issue?
Short answer, no. And I think to some extent that certainly within the Johnson administration, there was a sense that beauty was the answer, wasn't there? And the Building Better, the Building Beautiful Commission, and the white paper that came out of that was that I guess resistance to this stuff, or this new housing developments, would be considerably lessened if beauty were brought into the equation. I mean, obviously the definitions of beauty are fairly terrible, thin gruel in those kinds of discussions, and the idea that and the sort of answers offered are obviously painfully wrong-headed. So you'll see someone like government ministers talking about how return to sort of Georgian building would bring back a sense of place and local difference. And you go, well, if there's anything you could say about Georgian architecture, it's it erodes difference and place. Like, it's the same everywhere. That's what people like about it, right? I mean, the Georgians didn't give a fuck about regional conditions. And so, that's obviously deeply wrong-headed. I don't think, as much as I'm interested in style, I am very, very, very interested in style. I want to talk about that for sure. I don't think that's the problem here, actually. And I think in some senses this comes to a head of a slight contradiction in my sort of interest, or not a contradiction, but sort of two different kinds of areas of interest in a way. I think the answer to housing problems are almost inevitably strategic and policy driven, really. I think on a fundamental level, that's how we address and that's how we should address housing issues. And the reason that we have the housing we have at the moment is through a complete void in terms of policy direction. What we have is what happens when you don't have one. And when you have, I guess, governments, successive governments, conservative governments in particular, who are, one, very beholden to a powerful house building lobby, and two, essentially beholden to a free market ideology, which means that they are unable to consider how policy could change something, because they don't believe that policy is the answer. So therefore, it's not possible to make them. The only policies they do is to have less policy, i.e. deregulation. So part of that white paper was to try to deregulate the planning legislation that already exists. I don't think that's the answer either. I am very interested in ideas of expression and stylistic freedom. and therefore, I would welcome a kind of idea that planning legislation could start to be able to deal with that, i.e., that people could have more freedom of expression within sort of structures of where building occurs. I'm not interested in sort of particularly imposing a kind of stylistic or taste culture on people. Quite the opposite. I'm interested in complete stylistic freedom, really. And I'll come back to that in a second. But I am, and maybe we're going to talk about the Davison Prize in a little bit. But that was a project that we did, which really explored a kind of, as much as anything, explored an idea of how you might have a kind of governance structure, which negotiated levels of individual freedom against ideas of sort of civic and communal responsibility. And I think those are very important within housing. Maybe we'll come back to that. In terms of your question about style, though, I am super interested. It's interesting you mentioned Alan Powers, because Alan does talk, I think, very interestingly about style. One of the things I think that came out of, for me personally, out of the period of working at FAT and a kind of period, I suppose, of sort of consistently kind of prodding the edges of what is stylistically acceptable within architecture, with a sense that I just don't really subscribe to any kind of ideas of what you can or can't do stylistically. And I find that that idea that there's some sort of ethical dimension to sort of aesthetic, stylistic issues, I find kind of deeply bizarre in a way. I remember an old lecturer of mine, David Dunster, talking about the Protestant kind of puritanical tendency within UK architecture. And I think that's still very powerful. For during a lot of FAT's kind of time, we were very deliberately pushing at what the limits of that would be, to kind of expose the sort of mechanisms of control that exists within the discipline of architecture. So now, I find exploring architectural style to be, rather than superficial, I find it a very profound thing to be doing, and I really, I'm deeply interested in it. And I heard a lecture by Alan Powers, and he was talking about Neo-Georgian as possibly the most derided style of architecture, and that's something that sort of exists. It's sort of been endless returns, endless neo-geos, and we did we were designing a house recently, and we thought, well, we should have a go at neo-geo, because that might be the last stylistic bastion to break down. Because no one has a good word to say for that, but I find that kind of thing really interesting. And what is it about it that's so problematic, and why does it persistently exist, and why does it persistently return, and why do architects persistently dislike it?
Yeah, and yet, but I'm really, this idea around the austerity, I suppose, the austere aesthetics of the, as you put it, the puritanical way that architecture has developed, must be one of the reasons why it remains a marginal practice in relation to things like housing production. Yes, there's policy, of course, and that it seems to me too to be absolutely central to the issue of housing. But there is also the fact that volume house builders kind of do housing that people like.
That's a tricky one, isn't it? That's a tricky one, that, because
it looks kind of housey. When you buy a house by Persimmon, it looks kind of housey, and people want a house that looks kind of housey, and that includes little bits of ornament and little bits of frivolity, tiny bits, and sometimes not very much at all, but sometimes a lot. They're like the kind of footballers' suburbia kind of stuff, neo-palatial Las Vegan Georgian Tudor Beetham with a helipad kind of stuff.
I don't have. I'm aware that in these questions around, say, contemporary suburban housing, whatever, that there's many traps, one of which is, just simply to be snobby about different people's tastes. I think in a way that's a slightly different question. Well, I'd like to think it's a slightly different question. And at the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that, that is exactly what people want. But my sort of purpose is not to say, oh, I don't think they like that. They'd be much more excited if you showed them a book on Jorn Utsen's Danish housing schemes, and then they'd really get off on that. That's not really quite my mission. And I'm all for kind of stylistic variety, as I said. So, kind of more likely to enjoy stick-on porches than most architects. That doesn't really offend me, but I think it's also important to question how genuinely popular that is. It's a bit like sort of Adorno saying there's nothing wrong with popular culture. I just wish it was popular. It's like, is it really popular culture, or is it simply what is available at any one time? And who's making it? And I suppose that's why I'm quite interested in writers like Colin Ward, who are people who do look for genuinely popular forms of housing. What happens when housing escapes either, in his side, the sort of managerial bureaucracy of welfare state housing of the post-war era, or that which is sort of supplied to it by the market. So I think there's a danger in simply saying, because it's the market that's providing it, therefore it must be popular and right. I think that's too easy an assumption.
Yeah.
And something that we should definitely want to unpack a lot more. And the reason it's, as I've tried to say, the reason it is how it is mostly to do with a whole series of kind of forces, economic forces in relation to kind of land availability and planning on that level. What you get is what comes out of that process. I suppose what I'm interested in is like, what happens if you try to change that, and what might you want to do instead, and why might you want to do that? And that might be a question someone asks, is what's wrong with that, all of that stuff? And I suppose my answer to that would be, well, that to do with other questions to do with how society is organized, to do with kind of ecological questions, to do with like just generally sort of driving headlong into a kind of enormous crisis.
Yeah.
And it's not really about personal taste. And therefore, when I went to Poundbury, I wasn't, bits of Poundbury, I quite like bits of Poundbury, and I get quite, I'm like, okay, that's completely nuts, but that's fine with me if if someone wants to make a kind of miniature version of the centre of St. Petersburg in a Dorset field, then go for it. That's all right with me. I don't have, some bits of Poundbury are totally nuts, and I think, like there's a bit that Ben Treath has done, the later bits. There's a bit which is like Shad Thames, which is, and it's basically retirement homes. So we've got a kind of situation where someone's building essentially replicas of commercial wharf buildings that were later turned into sort of hipster lofts, and then building versions of that from scratch as elderly people's housing. And that's quite brain-frying, really, as a concept, as to why you might do that.
The dinner parties must be insane. They probably end up thumping late 90s house music.
Let's hope so.
Like the ketamine consumption in Poundbury is through the roof, and no one knows why. And it's all down to the architecture.
Yes, yeah.
I want to get onto the Davidson Prize, and I thought maybe I'm really interested. So I've seen you give a paper actually at a conference. I can't remember when it was, 5 or so years ago.
Yeah.
On plotlands, on Colin Ward's discussions around plotlands and your own engagement, which are amazing. And I think what for me and what I've always found so enticing about Colin Ward's stuff is this idea of agency and individuality being applied, in the case of plotlands, for example, to an absolutely uniform unit. And then over time, this kind of emergence of individuality. And you see that very much in A House for Essex, this idea of creating something that is individuated. Is this something to do with your, or a perspective about challenging totalizing visions, that the problem of modernity was it was a totalizing vision? The problem of build back better, build back beautiful, or whatever it was called, is that it's another totalizing vision. And they're trying to kind of answer the problem of totalizing visions by doing more totalizing, hegemonic, it's the institution trying to apply globally a solution that doesn't have a real, and what we need to be doing is finding kind of enabling people's voices in our settlements. And is that kind of what A House for Essex does? And is that kind of part of its intention and part of your kind of practice?
I am interested in that for sure. And both, in the sense that, communities become empowered to explore and enable their own environment. And I think that is really important, and that does stem from a number of things, but certainly kind of Colin Ward. And as you suggest, it feeds into the Davison Prize, which is a way of trying to take some of those ideas of individual freedom and a certain kind of open-endedness, that housing is a process and a temporal thing rather than a purely spatial thing. It changes over time, people change over time, people's needs change over time, and how you might make housing that kind of reflects that and accommodates different tastes and different sort of lifestyles, I suppose. So that's very much derived from a kind of a research period looking at forms of quite experimental dweller control housing, plotlands being one example of it. But I think Davison Prize is an attempt to sort of fuse that with something which also then has a kind of another sort of collective governance structure. So we were quite interested in that proposal, which I did, or my practice did, with a number of different people. So we worked with an artist, Verity Jane Keefe, who's done a lot of work looking at owner adaptation and how houses have changed over time, particularly in Barking and Dagenham, where she was an artist in residence. She had an exhibition at ROBA, which explored the way that those houses have changed over time. We worked with Quality of Life Foundation, which was set up by Sadie Morgan, which is about trying to understand, what's successful in housing schemes, how they work, and how you might start to actually sort of quantify that. And then Joseph Henry, who works at the GLA, and Joseph developed a sort of governance structure for how that kind of housing might happen. And what we developed was an idea of a sort of rental self-build or rental community build model, and that therefore you'd have sort of long-term investment and long-term security in your rental model. You could adapt and change your house. It was run by a trust that's part of a housing association that works with the local authority that initially owns the land. So there's a whole structure of how that housing might happen, and then how it might work over time. And so that's sort of the two things, really. The idea of how the housing could be quite simple, but allow huge diversity of expression, and then how that might actually enable people to live in it over time, so work together. So in that sense, the stylistic eclecticism and an idea of a relationship between the sort of collective and the individual were the two really important kind of parts of that scheme. I think in A House for Essex, it's different. I mean, it's hard to argue, as much as I love that project and love working on it, hard to argue that, a kind of single holiday home designed, with an artist, quite a sort of one-off bespoke situation, has too many wider kind of implications in terms of, you know, housing and settlements and stuff like that. What I do think that project has, and because obviously it's in Essex and about Essex, and Grace and Perry and myself are both from Essex, is it does explore, I think, genuinely qualities of that place and qualities of Essexness. Some of which is, you know, some of which is obvious, I think, you know, like people would say, like, you know, that house has got huge amounts of kind of, it's hugely extrovert, it's kind of got a certain amount of bling to it, it's kind of like, you know, has a, it flirts with a certain kind of Essex vulgarity, maybe. And other ways it sort of relates to Essex probably in slightly subtler ways, which are sort of, you know, because it's a very highly raw and sort of expressive object, it might be easy to miss some of the other ways that I think it's kind of embedded in that place. But I do think it has a certain kind of Essexness about it. And Essex was, you know, a place which had huge amounts of kind of plotland communities for various reasons, kind of London overspill, and the way that Essex sort of develops in the 20th century, you know, is quite relevant in relation to some of the ideas in A House for Essex, and you know, in the storyline of the character that Grayson created for it, there's a sort of journey through from a sort of plotlands community through the new town of Basildon, and then the kind of Thatcherite new town of Southwood and Ferrers, and then various other places that person lives, and then you end up in North Essex, which is a sort of agricultural, slightly more affluent bit of Essex. And so, yeah, I think, you know, there's lots of those ideas are sort of present in there, in as much as it is ultimately a sort of single, rather unique house.
I want to come back to the idea of the co-living in the countryside, this project, because I think it's a really, I mean, you won the prize in 2022 and you're a judge this year, but it seems to me in what you've been saying that there's a kind of standing back in a way of the architect and the taste of the architect. The architect needs to stand down a bit and foreground other people, other creative people. In the case of Co-Living in the Countryside, Verity Keefe and Joseph Henry, and your other collaborators, but also that there's this idea of standing back to, in some cases, slightly what might be seen as slightly the word tasteless, but I don't mean them tasteless. I mean sort of popular versions of what taste is. And I think that's a really interesting thing. How does an architect operate in that field? How do you go about standing down when we've spent so much of our education, so much of our kind of idea of what it is to be an architect is to be the big man?
I think useful, probably in this sense, to invoke Robert Venturi and Denise Scott Brown, who are two, you know, very influential thinkers on fat and on me still, you know, that their idea that really learning to like things is quite important. You know, a lot of architectural education, and I don't mean to be down on architectural education, which I think is kind of remarkable, and you know, I love being involved in it. But I do think historically one of the effects of it is to sort of limit what you like in quite an amazingly efficient way, actually. You know, you get all sorts of people arriving at architectural education, and then within about 2 years, everyone's massively into the thermal baths at Val's, and you think that's quite weird, isn't it? Why is everyone like that? I mean, is it objectively just the pinnacle, or is there something, you know, kind of just amazing about the way that people's taste starts to sort of coalesce around certain, you know, very specific things? I feel like I've been on the opposite journey. I'm trying to like more things, and I think that would help. Generally, you know, I find stylistic partisanship in architecture just completely baffling. Like people who campaign vigorously for saving a brutalist car park, but who will cheer when, you know, a Terry Fowell building from the 80s is up for, you know, demolition. And I'm like, I just don't understand. I literally have a sort of cognitive problem with how you could want buildings that you don't like to be demolished. I mean, first of all, I like both. You know, I love a lot of brutalist buildings, and I love a lot of postmodernist buildings. And I don't mean to be wet. I mean, there's a lot of buildings I really dislike, but none of them I want really to be demolished, I have to say. So I find that sort of, that partisanship pretty bewildering. And I'm much more into the opposite of that, which is a kind of stylistic kind of variety. I like quite rich stuff in architecture. I like weird stuff. I like things that are sort of oddly outside of very obvious traditions, things that sort of fall outside of the proper and the normal and the right. I'm drawn to quite a lot of, I guess, historic architecture for that reason, because quite a lot of it was produced in ways that architecture isn't now, which probably comes back to the nub of your question. That when architecture was produced not by, through professional models and, contractors and architects and QSs, but produced in much more sort of kind of organic ways, I suppose, that, different people would be designing different bits, or like bits of it would be built without anyone designing it at all. And then someone come along and change a bit of it later and add something else to it, and then something else to that. And I find that really fascinating. And I like the kind of richness that comes out of that. And I think my tastes have become much more kind of eclectic and Catholic as well. I've always loved kind of classical architecture, in its, kind of whether that's sort of, English classicism and the kind of Baroque of Hawksmoor, later Soane and people like that. But now I like lots of sort of slightly strange in-between periods as well. And, I really like the work of Raymond Erith, for example, who's like a kind of post-war classicist in the UK, who made incredibly weird, strange, rather wonderful buildings that sort of evade easy categorization. He was sort of following a fairly sort of odd trajectory of his own. And I think architecture does have a tendency to kind of remove a lot of that and sort of create a kind of taste culture of its own, which is interested in, a fairly narrow sort of stylistic range and a fairly sort of narrow definition of what good architecture is. And I don't really subscribe to that.
No. I was wondering though, because I saw these wonderful images on your Instagram or Twitter from your recent visit to Glasgow, and you picked out this beautiful window, which was a Baroque Glaswegian mercantile Baroque idicule within an idicule.
Yeah.
And I thought, for me, I mean, it is amazing. And it is so ballsy, actually. I mean, the nuts on the architect is unbelievable, but it was also based in a really solid understanding of what game they were playing. And I do wonder whether to be eclectic effectively, both in what you appreciate and in what you then produce, you actually need to know this stuff. And that's complicated. And that's perhaps where the kind of Dreich kind of utilitarian forms of architecture that we call modernism now, but are nothing really of the sort. They're just kind of like sheds with, that's why that's the answer. Because actually the job of learning this is so complex. I don't know. How have you kind of sort of? I suppose how do we teach this? I suppose is the question. Like,
well, that is really
the point where people know about this.
I think there's lots of interesting things there. In terms of well, sometimes interesting things happen because people sort of fail, but fail kind of well. So, quite a lot of interesting buildings often because someone's trying to do something and they sort of end up doing something else. And yeah, I guess, to sort of practice, a really highly refined form of mannerism, you've got to have understood or absorbed very effectively the kind of rules of classicism, I guess. But, I think, also actually, if you look at kind of history of architecture, that's not always the case. That sort of artisan mannerism of, 17th century, where people are sort of badly copying stuff and then badly slightly badly copying stuff, they're producing something quite unusual. So I don't know whether that supreme sort of control is quite so critical, actually, for me. And there are examples of that, but there also are examples of something different, which is where the rules haven't been quite learned properly, and that produces something quite interesting as well. I mean, I think it's not to say that there aren't sort of bad bits of architecture in a way that exists. Certainly there are, but the worst kinds of architecture, I guess, for me, are the bits that where are just a sort of overwhelming cynicism that's in place, and a kind of execution of very soulless execution of completely understood simple sorts of logics is probably the stuff I'm least interested in. Yeah. And I don't think everything has to be super rich either. I mean, I'm drawn to those bits that are, but they're obviously, I don't feel like every building has to be some extraordinary sort of piece of work in its own right. You can just have some ordinary okay stuff too. But I think my eye and my taste is always drawn to things which are slightly sort of marginal and slightly kind of something a little odd has crept in around the edges, whatever that is, whatever the sort of influence is, or the position, or the geographic place. I quite like you find a building which sort of doesn't quite belong where it is, for various reasons. That creates a kind of interest. In terms of how you teach it, I don't know. I mean, I think I think a lot about this, obviously, and I think that the tension in a lot of architecture education, I guess, is between a desire to address a sort of subject area and a need to teach a kind of formal, skill-based set of understandings. And I think within current architecture education, the emphasis is certainly at postgrad level is often on, okay, well, we're going to look this year at, and there's a big theme. But essentially what you're hoping to get out of that is 12 or 15 or 20, really skillful projects. And the reason I say that, I suppose, is that the formal question isn't discussed very much. I think it should be discussed much more, and I talk about it quite a lot. I mean, one of the things about this conversation I quite like is actually talking about kind of formal aspects of architecture. I think is really important. I don't think it's trivial, and we should be talking about social concerns exclusively. I think what architects do is make things, and those things need to be talked about and discussed and explored as formal objects, because that's how we make them. But I think there probably is a bias away from that now, I think, and to talk about the condition in which we design rather than the design.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant point to finish on. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Nice to talk to you, Ambrose.
Good in every way, every day. Thanks to Charles for spending time speaking with me, and with such clarity. Please see the podcast description for more links to Charles's practice and catalogue, present and back, and to the various bits on the Davidson Prize scheme too, and material he's presented around that. Do share this episode, of course, and thanks for listening. Cheers.